Donald Trump calls it the worst deal ever. The question is, why is he so hell-bent on decertifying a 2015 Iran nuclear agreement when even his own cabinet seems in large part to support it? The move consistent with the U.S. president's bid to unwind any and all the policies of his predecessor, and on the day when Washington's announced it's pulling out of UNESCO for being too anti-Israeli. How far will Trump go? Few expect the U.S. to walk away from the deal, but Trump could stiffen sanctions. Will his moves help prevent or trigger a nuclear arms race in the region? He's officially set to brand the elite Iranian Revolutionary Guards Corps a terror organization. What impact will that have? Critics contend it will simply bolster the IRGC. What impacts will Trump's moves have on an Iran and where internal battles are still brewing between moderates and hardliners? What impact on a broader region that's seen a ratcheting up of Tehran's presence over the past years in the backing of military campaigns in Iraq, Syria, Yemen? Today in the France24 Debate, Trump takes on Tehran. With us to talk about it, he's a former Iranian nuclear negotiator. Sayed Hossein Mousavian is with Princeton University's program on science and global security. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
From Washington, he's worked for the U.S. State and Defense Departments on the Middle East and Iran negotiating. Elon Goldenberg, Senior Fellow at the Center for a New American Security. Welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
And from Washington, we welcome back former U.S. Intelligence Officer Michael Pregin, Adjunct Fellow at the Hudson Institute.
Thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
The France24 Debate on Facebook and Twitter, the hashtag F24Debate. Yes, the word of the day is decertification, a bit of a mouthful. In this context, it means the White House could leave the final decision on the Iran deal with the lawmakers in Congress. An announcement now expected by Friday. Sanam Chantier has more.
It was Barack Obama's chief foreign policy accomplishment. His successor has since called it the worst deal ever negotiated. Donald Trump is now weighing a new strategy to confront the nuclear pact, also known as the JCPOA, clenched by Tehran and the world powers back in 2015. This despite the fact that Iran is not violating the terms of the agreement. That's according to international bodies. Under US law, every 90 days the president is required to certify the Islamic Republic's compliance. By not doing so, Trump is triggering a 60-day review process by Congress and a potential battle over the fate of the deal. Once those 2 months are up, the question is whether the US will reimpose some or all of the draconian sanctions that were lifted 2 years ago in exchange for Tehran scaling back its nuclear activities.
If this goes to a vote in Congress, there is a decent chance that Congress actually would not be able to pass new sanctions on Iran because most Democrats recognize the dangers of doing this. And the Trump administration, or President Trump himself, has created so much discord within the Republican caucus. So there's reasons to believe that several Republicans may also decide not to vote in favor of sanctions.
If Congress does bring back the punitive measures, that will kill America's participation in the JCPOA. Next up, the question of how other deal signatories will react if Washington withdraws. They are the UK, France, Germany, China and Russia. Early signs show they're not interested in pulling out, but of course, then European firms could be faced with a choice: doing business in Iran or the US. According to analysts, if America does not go ahead with new sanctions, decertification could just be a symbolic gesture by Trump to save face. Whatever happens, one thing is for sure. For its part, Iran has confirmed that the JCPOA is not renegotiable.
Elon Goldenberg, you've written a piece in The Atlantic where you say, and I quote, that if there is decertification, we won't face an immediate crisis, but over time, Iran is likely to restart its deliberate march to a nuclear bomb. This will not inevitably lead to war, but it will mean a significant increase in the risk. How great a risk, and at what speed?
Sure. Well, the risk is significant, and I think we'd be looking potentially at a number of years, because I think as your reporters point out, the decertification does not by itself end the nuclear agreement. And in fact, it's quite likely Congress will not pass the type of sanctions that tank the deal immediately. But it is a highly destabilizing step. You'll probably see some new sanctions from Congress potentially, more distrust on Iran's part, more distrust on everybody else's part, more hesitance from the international community and especially from the business community to invest. And so you're going to see a weakening of the agreement, which could eventually lead to its collapse. And then Iran will start its nuclear program again and slowly start going there. It could be 2 years, it could be 4 years, it could be 5 years. But eventually, you know, when I worked at the Defense Department, this is the question we are dealing with, the potential that we would get to that point of no return, where Iran's nuclear program was so close that the United States would have to choose between allowing Iran to go nuclear or taking military action against it. And that's a terrible scenario. What we've done right now with the agreement is much more effective. It keeps Iran contained. It keeps the nuclear program contained. There are weaknesses in the agreement, but those can be addressed through other means than risking the deal by walking away or starting this decertification process.
Elon, in the past days, have you been in contact with your former colleagues at the Defense Department?
Yeah, I mean, I continue to talk to friends and colleagues across the U.S. government and on the Hill about their concerns and there is this overwhelming view. You know, there was a real debate in Washington about whether or not we should pursue the nuclear agreement. And that was a legitimate, tough debate, and there were real fundamental disagreements. But there is almost no debate now in Washington except from the president and a small group of people about whether or not the United States should walk away from the deal or even risk it by decertifying. I mean, you have Secretary Mattis, the defense secretary, saying that it's in the national interest to stay in. You have the Secretary of State saying that the U.S. is complying. You have a lot of members, Republican members of Congress, even the chairman of the House Foreign Affairs Committee yesterday, Ed Royce, who was a vocal opponent of the agreement, saying that we just need to be enforcing it vigorously. And so we're not even at a point, honestly, the advisors around the president have tried to convince him that this is the case, and he is basically the one, whether it be because he promised to walk away from the agreement, his dislike for what comes next in terms of President Obama and his legacy. It's not exactly clear why, but the president is insistent on going down this pathway. And the other thing I think that's just important to emphasize here is that, yes, this punts the issue to Congress, but the president can end this whenever he wants to. He is the one, he has the authority to not waive sanctions. And not certifying does not end the nuclear agreement. But if the president were to choose to not waive sanctions, then all the nuclear sanctions can be imposed without any help from Congress. And that could restart the program. That would end the agreement and re-trigger all these problems. And so his move to decertify seems like this kind of weird, halfway, cop-out, not clear what he wants to do, blame it on Congress, maybe kill the deal, maybe not kill the deal. It's indicative of just a broken policy process and the fact that none of his advisors actually think this is a good idea, but he's looking for a political way out.
All right, so we're talking about politics, not policy here. Michael Pregent, first of all, who in your view has the president's ear right now? And to answer Elon Goldenberg's last point there, why is the president putting this effectively in Congress's hands?
What I would say to this is, listen, decertification gives us leverage. You look at what President Macron has said to just counter everything that was just said about supporters here in Congress or Tillerson or Mattis. Even Macron says that it should be relooked at, and we should look at ending the sunset clause, that we should be able to have access to these military sites where this testing has taken place in the past. Now, when I say testing, it's not testing that shows up in any of our sensors as radioactive material, but actually the testing of the triggers, the testing of the military components of a nuclear weapon. Those things are taking place, and maybe they're not taking place, but here's what the president's listening to. He's listening to the part of the intelligence community is actually saying, sir, we have intelligence gaps here. We cannot verify whether Iran is in compliance with Annex 1, Section T, which is basically the delivery system for a nuclear weapon, the triggers.
Because the International Atomic Energy Agency seems pretty firm that saying Tehran is complying.
They actually also said we cannot confirm whether or not that testing is taking place at Fordo and Parchin. And they actually said this: we're not going to go inspect these sites purely for political reasons. We need intelligence from the administration that says there's something ongoing. Well, we can't rely on signals intercept because we're being messaged, and it goes like this: we are not violating the JCPOA. We are not violating the Iran deal. That's what's being messaged in SIGINT. We don't have any human sources, meaning human intelligence sources, that can verify whether or not Iran is complying. We have to rely on signatures. So when you have an intelligence gap, you have to address it. Certification gives us leverage to verify that. Just looking at what Senator Schumer said about the Iran deal in 2015, he said we cannot verify whether or not Iran is testing the triggers and the military components of its nuclear program at Fordo and Parchin because the JCPOA doesn't make it a 24/7 anytime, anywhere inspection. And the IAEA has no interest in checking it out. And one of the issues is, the IRGC has a directorate that's actually in Vienna with its primary task to intimidate IAEA inspectors. So the president is looking at North Korea. How do we keep Iran from becoming North Korea? How do we keep the Iran situation from becoming a position where we have only military options and hopefully China's able to do something? There is no China when it comes to Iran. We have to prevent Iran from becoming North Korea. Now listen, in 6 years, Iran could be a conventional military force in the Middle East. They're able to buy advanced weapons. In 8 years, they can start their ballistic missile program.
Right, but the reasoning is that without this deal, you'll have a nuclear arms race between Iran and Saudi Arabia.
Yeah, I don't buy that. The deal is actually causing the arms race. Without the deal, everybody gets to see who Iran really is, and we're able to do something. The Iran deal is actually allowing Iran to do things under the cover of, if we sanction Iran for this or if we sanction Iran for that, they'll walk away. Iran convinced the Obama administration that any additional sanctions would be cause for Iran to walk away. With every recertification of the Iran deal by the Trump administration, there have been additional sanctions on the IRGC, on Iran's ballistic missile program, and Iran hasn't walked away. They're already trying to hint that they're willing to negotiate ballistic missiles and also say that they'll continue to be a partner in the war against ISIS, which I find laughable. Yeah, sure.
Let me bring in Sayed Hossein Mousavian on these points, and there's several important ones you bring up. First of all, the deal so far, how's it going?
The deal is going very well. The International Atomic Energy Organization, which is the main international body to judge about the deal, at least 8 times since the implementation of the deal, has confirmed Iran has fully complied with all its commitment within the nuclear deal.
But you heard Michael Pregent there saying that there's stuff that they're not inspecting.
Look, the problem with the U.S. is this. The U.S. is one of the players in this game. But the U.S. wants to be player and referee both. The U.S. wants to be plaintiff and the judge. It cannot, nobody is going to accept it. The U.S. is not the judge. The U.S. is not the referee. The International Atomic Energy Organization is the referee. 8 times they have confirmed. The other parties of United Nations Security Council, all other countries, they are fully satisfied with full implementation of the deal. Therefore, the U.S. and Israel, they are the only countries making these claims. You can make claim, but you are not the judge. This is the issue. However, when Trump is saying this is the worst deal, the international community, except the U.S. and Israel, they are convinced this is the best deal because this is the most comprehensive agreement ever made during the history of non-proliferation on transparency measures and all objective guarantees toward non-weaponization, nuclear weaponization.
Say it, Hussein
with the
Mousavid. Let me
JCPOA.
ask you about this because our viewers, just to clarify for our viewers, you heard Michael Predgen talk about ballistic missile testing. That's not in the nuclear deal. It's something separate. Nonetheless, doesn't that hurt Iran's cause in terms of convincing public opinion when it goes and tests ballistic missiles at this crucial moment?
No, again, here the problem with the U.S. is that the U.S. is very happy to sell $350 billion of arms to Iranian rivalry, Saudi Arabia, and if Iran has one missile test, is crying Iran should stop missile test. Iran is an independent country. Iran has to have military capability to defend itself because Iran is the country in the region invaded by the neighbors. When Iraq invaded, Saudi Arabia and the regional countries they supported, US supported the invasion of Iran, Europe, Russia, they all supported the invasion of Iran. Since Iran has been invaded, Iran has to have conventional arms capability to defend itself. It is a legitimate Iranian demand. Therefore, when the U.S. is putting his point on the Iranian conventional arms capability, and when the U.S. always is emphasizing all options are on the table, therefore Iranians are feeling threatened, especially when the U.S. is selling hundreds of billions of dollars of most sophisticated conventional arms to Iranian neighbors. Therefore, we have to understand the realities.
Ilan Goldenberg, before we go to the break, where people watching this discussion may think it's a two-way deal. Of course, if the U.S. walks away, how much does it matter since the signatories are, well, the other Security Council members, the European Union, Germany? The deal, will it still work without the U.S.?
Not really. I think what happens is if the U.S. walks away and starts reimposing secondary sanctions, you're going to have a lot of international companies pull out of Iran, and then Iran walks away from the agreement. On the other hand, you're also not going to be able to get the kind of leverage and pressure that you had previously because you're not going to have unity. So I think a lot of companies will make the decision that the United States was in the wrong, and especially since we won't have the support from our partners, and we'll continue to invest. And so you'll end up with this very leaky, weak sanctions regime that isn't going to bring Iran to the table. I also want to go back just to one point on this question of triggers and preventing Iran from getting a nuclear weapon. Look, Iran can only have a nuclear weapon if it has highly enriched uranium or if it has reprocessed plutonium. And the nuclear agreement makes sure that it doesn't have that. So it is always very, very difficult to find intelligence on whether or not you have issues going on with detonators and weaponization. That's one piece of building a nuclear weapon. That's the hardest piece to track and find. But you can build that, which is what Michael was talking about. But if you don't have any HEU, or the plutonium, you can't actually build a nuclear weapon. And the deal succeeds in doing that. And so this whole argument that we don't have perfect intelligence and not 100% absolute fidelity on this one thing, I think, is a problem. The other thing I think is worth pointing out is that President Macron did say he's open to looking at adjustments in a future agreement. He's open to looking at questions about sunset provisions and Iran's regional behavior, which I agree. The deal doesn't cover all those things, and there are flaws in the agreement. But the way to get there is not to decertify. The way to get there is President Macron has said to President Trump, I want to talk about those things. So why doesn't President Trump say, yes, okay, let's start working together on dealing with these problems while we stay in the agreement? Because what President Macron has said is, we only do this if we stay in the agreement. We're not open to renegotiating or starting a new deal. We are open to starting to talk about these problems and looking for long-term solutions. And so I think that would be the sensible strategy.
We're going to pick up on these points when we come back. Stay with us. You're watching the France24 Debate.
What do you want from your news website? France24.com, giving you easier access to information and faster for a unique experience. France24.com, the international news website.
Reporters Plus, presented by Mark Owen.
A 100 years ago, the Russian Revolution changed the face of the world. What remains today, and why is the Kremlin so bothered by its centennial? There are those whose families fled to exile and escape of the Bolsheviks' repression, and the nostalgics for a certain societal model. France24 brings you an exclusive report on the history of an uncomfortable anniversary, Russia's ghosts of 1917.
Reporters Plus on France24 and France24.com.
Welcome back. Before we resume the France24 debate, some of the stories that Laura Cellier is following for you in the newsroom. The United States pulls out of UNESCO, accusing the Paris-based world body for education, science, and culture of an anti-Israel bias. The outgoing Director General tells France24 of her regret and leaves the door open for Washington to return. Celebrations in Gaza as rival Palestinian factions seal a reconciliation deal that paves the way for Hamas to hand over administrative powers there to a Fatah-backed government. National Day in Spain, marked by a parade in Madrid and a pro-unionist demonstration in Barcelona. The push in Catalonia to secede high on the minds. The police raids across Europe target Paris Saint-Germain owner Nasser Al-Khelaifi, the Qatari owner of beIN Sport Television, suspected of bribery to obtain TV rights for several World Cups. We'll have all of the day's sports news with Kedevan Gorgistani. Welcome back, or welcome if you're just joining us. It's the France24 debate. We're anticipating Donald Trump's next move when it comes to Iran. He has until October the 15th to say whether or not he signs on for the Iran nuclear agreement or passes the ball to Congress in what's known as decertification when it comes to that 2015 agreement that was fleshed out by the Security Council members plus Germany. With us to talk about it, Sayed Hossein Mousavian with Princeton University's Program on Science and Global Security, former Iran nuclear negotiator. Welcome back. Welcome back as well to Elon Goldenberg, Senior Fellow at the Center for a New American Security, and who's been writing about this issue in Foreign Policy and in The Atlantic. And from Washington, former U.S. intelligence officer Michael Pregin, adjunct fellow at the Hudson Institute. A lot of reactions on the hashtag F24 debate, and a lot of them are about, well, the politics of this. One viewer is saying, I really wish the Republicans would stop pretending Iran was a bad deal just because it was penned by Democrats. This is about world safety, not politics. Well, a different tack taken by Donald Trump. At a speech in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania on Wednesday, the U.S. president mentioned Iran while talking about renegotiating NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement.
We're renegotiating various other deals with foreign countries that are so embarrassing and so horrendous that you would say, why on earth would anybody have signed a deal like that? I'll also be announcing, as you know, my statement and what we'll be doing with respect to the Iran deal, speaking of badly negotiated deals, okay? We're doing that very shortly.
Michael Pregin, I asked you the question. I'll put it to you again. Who's whispering in Donald Trump's ear right now when it comes to this Iran issue? And is it right to, well, put a nuclear deal on the same footing as a trade deal?
Well, the first question again, I'm a former intelligence officer. He's listening to people in the National Security Council that worked this issue before. And he's simply asking the question, is the JCPOA keeping Iran from becoming a nuclear weaponized power? And they can't answer that question because the JCPOA doesn't allow them. And going back to Elon's point about triggers and systems, the JCPOA allows Iran, by not being able to inspect Fordo and Parchin, to develop the trigger. And then in 8 years, if they stay in the JCPOA, they can actually develop the munition. So that it allows a parallel track. It allows the nuclear enrichment part to, it allows the trigger to catch up to that.
But Michael,
And that's the
Michael, let
big
me
issue
ask you
here.
that question again, because we heard what Donald Trump was saying. We have the sense that when you speak in the same sentence about the nuclear deal and the trade deal, he seems to be just against anything that's multilateral.
Yeah, I ran an ad that was critical of Trump on the Iran deal, and I said, I think President Trump thinks the Iran deal is bad because we didn't get a contract out of it. We didn't get any money out of it. So on that point, I'll concede that. But the Iran deal, the U.S. assumes all the risk. We're the ones that have to make sure Iran doesn't become a nuclear power, while our European allies get to invest in a $400 billion economy. The issue is, with decertification, it's going to happen. This debate's not going to stop decertification tomorrow. It's going to happen tomorrow, and then we have to deal with what does Iran do about it. Iran's definition or translation of the JCPOA has always been more important than ours, and I think we'll be able to see things there. But again, our European allies, they're not going to walk away from us. We're an $18 trillion economy. They're not going to put their banks in jeopardy. Remember, German intelligence has already warned their companies and their banks that Iran has had 32 instances of trying to procure dual-purpose materials out of Germany, and that they could be sanctioned by U.S. Treasury for doing that, and they can be sanctioned by their own government for doing that. So there are a lot of wavering European allies, not wavering towards the United States position, but wavering whether or not they should invest in Iran based on the fact that the Revolutionary Guard Corps has its tentacles in every aspect, every sector of Iran's economy, and doing business with them actually makes you a target of the U.S. Treasury Department in a lot of ways.
Now let's talk about that. The 125,000 strong Iran Revolutionary Guard, who also have command over the Basiji paramilitary force, also, as you say, have ties to businesses, which means it could be harder to do international transactions if Donald Trump follows through with his idea of placing the Revolutionary Guards on a terror organization list. In Tehran, pragmatists like the foreign minister, Mohammad Javad Zarif, going on the record to support the IRGC.
We have repeatedly said that the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps is the pride of the country, and it guarantees our country's defence, preservation of the revolution and the defence of our borders. The role of the IRGC was extraordinary during the imposed war. Americans, by taking such steps, will only isolate themselves further from the Iranian people and become more notorious in their eyes.
Sayed Hussein Mousavian, what will be the consequences of putting the Revolutionary Guards on a terror watch list?
Revolutionary Guard is actually Iranian army. Every citizen of every country, they are supporting their army. No doubt, Iranians with consensus from each fraction, they would support their army, including Revolutionary Guard. No doubt about it. But the consequences would be that Iran also would put American army as a terrorist group. The fact is, Iran and the US, they are two major players in the Middle East, Persian Gulf. The other fact is that they have very important common interests like fighting ISIS. The other fact is that Iran is the leading force fighting ISIS in Iraq and in Syria and in the region. Therefore, putting Iranian army as a terrorist group and in reciprocation, in return, putting the American army as a terrorist group would kill any chance for any type of cooperation on the regional issues and only would escalate tension, confrontation, and instability in the region.
But we know, and with senior leaders who do have their hands in business, like you see with top military brass in places like Egypt and Algeria, how crippling would being on this terror list be?
American army also has hand in the business. Many armies in the world, they have hand in the business. It is not only Iranian or Algerian or Pakistani or Indian. Many other armies in the region also, they have hands in economy. They are part of their country. You cannot say who can be in the business, who cannot be. It is a sovereign country. It is independent country, and they decide themselves. It is none of the business of the U.S. administration to interfere on internal affair of Iran.
Ilan Goldenberg, your thoughts on putting the IRGC on a terror organization list?
Honestly, the U.S. needs to find ways to counter the IRGC's behavior in the Middle East. In Syria, in Yemen, its support for Hezbollah in Lebanon, and even in Iraq, yes, we both dislike ISIS and there's some opportunities for cooperation, but there's also fundamental disagreements where the IRGC and especially the Quds Force has taken a pretty sectarian approach in the types of groups that it supports, which is not created a situation for long-term stability in Iraq and Syria and elsewhere. The U.S. has really been the leading force against ISIS in most places, together with the Kurds in Syria for certain, while the IRGC is focused primarily on going after the moderate opposition and supporting Bashar al-Assad. So I think that the whole point, my view on all of this is, it's fine for the U.S. to go after the IRGC. It's fine for the U.S. to find other creative ways to target Iran's destabilizing behavior in the region, whether that's interdicting ships with weapons on them, whether that's going after groups that Iran supports. I'm totally fine with that. And you know what? We can do all of that while still abiding by the nuclear agreement. And that is the key. The key is that we have this big problem with the nuclear issue, which if Iran gets a nuclear weapon, all these other problems become much, much worse. And by the way, we had fundamental debates in the U.S. government for years about whether we would actually go to war, a major war with Iran over the nuclear issue. We don't have those debates about Iran's support for the IRGC. We have debates about various ways to counter and support them, but it's not the type of thing that would trigger a major war because it's not as significant for a national interest. It still matters. And so I think we should go after it aggressively. And I'm okay doing that as long as the steps that we take to do that aren't actually poison pills for killing the nuclear problem. The nuclear agreement. This is my big concern, is that the president or Congress or others pass a whole bunch of nuclear sanctions that they say are to go after the IRGC and counter Iran's behavior, but actually are going to kill the nuclear agreement. And so there's a balancing act to be struck there. And that's a big question for the next few months, is whether Congress and the Trump administration figure out how to balance that. But ultimately, I think going after the IRGC is absolutely justified.
Absolutely justified. In the current context, though, what is the mood in Washington when it comes to all this? Because as you said at the outset, there are conflicting signals.
Oh, in terms of how the administration, what the administration will do? I think there are conflicting signals. So let me give you an example of an issue of how this could blow up in an unfortunate way. There's been ideas about, for example, sanctioning Iran Air, because Iran Air provides weaponry into Syria and shuttles weaponry into Syria. That would, for example, kill a major deal between Boeing, Airbus, and the Iranian government and Iran Air, which was explicitly part of the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the nuclear deal. So that would, for example, be a mistake. So the question is how to find this balancing act. And I think the mood in Washington is, look, the mood on the Hill and the mood among the president's advisors is the mood I am describing, is to find some kind of middle ground where you are able to push back on Iran's bad behavior, but keep the nuclear agreement and not walk away from it in a way that isolates the United States internationally, takes away the restrictions that do exist on Iran's nuclear program, and replaces them with a weak and leaky sanctions regime, which is what we would end up with because you'd have this major division with our partners and allies. Yes, many would walk away, many would not risk going back into Iran, but some would. And that's very different than where we were in 2012 and 11, where we really had the entire world behind these sanctions and were able to cut Iran's oil sales in half. We're not going to get back there using this approach. And so that's the balancing act we need to find. And that's, I think, where what members on the Hill and a lot of the president's own advisors are looking for is that right balance in the middle.
There is one nation that's pleased by the positions that Donald Trump has taken. And by the way, we're speaking on the day when the United States has announced that it's withdrawing from UNESCO, the UN's Education, Science, and Culture Organization, and that is Israel. And on that point, Michael Pregin, there's the feeling that Donald Trump is catering to hawks in Israel, and that's what's motivating his reasoning when it comes both to Iran and the UNESCO decision.
Well, you can also look at it as the UNESCO decision is something to make Israel happy while we disappoint over here with the JCPOA and designating the Revolutionary Guard Corps. You usually see an overture and then a disappointment to mask it, and especially on a Friday news cycle, Friday evening news cycle, and not everybody's covering it. Back to Iran's interpretation of the Iran deal. I agree with Elon that the Revolutionary Guard Corps should be sanctioned. We've been doing that with the Quds Force. The best part about that is Iran believes that's a violation of the nuclear deal. Iran believes that's reason for them to walk away. So that's great. We keep focused on the Revolutionary Guard Corps, especially the Quds Force. We need to designate the Quds Force as a foreign terrorist organization. But what that also does, which is really interesting, it actually makes the U.S. complicit in giving money to the Iraqi Ministry of Interior that is paying IRGC operatives who are designated terrorists like Abu Mahdi al-Muhandis from Kitab Hezbollah and others. So it actually would correct our action in Iraq because Iran has basically outsourced culpability to Iraq's security forces as they do what Elon says, as they continue to overly conduct operations against Sunnis of Iraq, the Sunnis of Syria, and they're primarily focused on negating threats from Iraq and Syria from its Sunni populations. And this isn't never been a campaign.
But Michael, this
ISIS.
is just realpolitik, and we've discussed this before. The U.S. and Iran have common interests on the battlefield in Iraq and Afghanistan, and rival interests in places like Syria.
More rival interests in Iraq and Afghanistan and Syria, and few common ones. Iran is providing lethal aid to the Taliban. That's not in the U.S. interest. Iran's militias are moving to Syria through Iraq to shore up Assad and attack and trying to test our resolve at U.S. bases where we train rebels in Syria. That's not in our interest.
Hang on, you're saying Iran is backing the Taliban?
Yeah, Iran is providing lethal aid to the Taliban. Everybody in our intelligence community knows that. They continue to do that. So when I go to Capitol Hill and I talk to congressmen and senators, when I see Americans on their wall, pictures of them in Afghanistan and Iraq, I say, listen, you know Qasem Soleimani has killed Americans in Iraq and that he's providing lethal aid to the Taliban in Afghanistan and they've killed Americans. Yes, that's a fact. That's easy. That's even an open source reporting.
Syed Hussein Mousavian, at this particular juncture in time, what is we heard earlier that clip from the foreign minister who's in the pragmatist camp in Tehran. If the rhetoric is ratcheted up in Washington, what will happen domestically, internal politics inside of Iran?
The domestic understanding of Iran on who is destabilizing the region is very important. Iranians, they all believe it was the U.S. invasion of Iraq, destabilizing Iraq. It was the U.S. invasion of Afghanistan, destabilizing of Afghanistan.
Right, but what happens? How does this affect that? How does this affect that tug of war? Excuse me, between the hardliners and the more moderates inside of Iran?
No, here exactly this is what I'm going to explain. Moderates and hardliners, they have consensus. The U.S. war on Iraq, U.S. war on Afghanistan, U.S. war on Libya, U.S. war on Yemen with Saudi Arabia, these are the main sources of destabilization of the region. Therefore, now, fighting Iranian Revolutionary Guard, who is the leading force against ISIS in the region, therefore would leave no doubt on the Iranian side. The U.S. is trying to support ISIS. Fighting Revolutionary Guard is exactly a move by the U.S. to support ISIS because ISIS have been experiencing huge defeats during last year. More ISIS has been defeated. The US has decided more to put pressure on Iranian army and Revolutionary Guard because they are actually fighting, the main sources are fighting ISIS. Therefore, if the US goes on putting Revolutionary Guard on terrorist list, Iranians, they would have no doubt this is another move by the US to destabilize Iran, to destabilize the region. Therefore, we have to be very realistic. We cannot say the US invasion of Iraq, Afghanistan, the Saudi-US war on Yemen, the NATO-Saudi GCC wars on Libya, they are really the reasons of expansion of terrorism and bringing the region to a mess. But I really don't understand why they are blaming Iran, because Iran is the only country who has saved Iraq. Iraqis, they all say.
Hang on, Iran's the only country that saved Iraq? I mean, there's also been a huge US presence, the Kurdish Peshmerga forces.
No, hold on. You have heard from Iraqi Prime Minister saying without Iranian support, Baghdad would have collapsed in the hand of ISIS.
But there's also been a US military buildup.
No, US is there. Of course, they have military strike. But with the US, ISIS could occupy 40% of Iraq. With the US, ISIS was able to occupy Mosul, Kirkuk. And if without Iranian help, the US would have occupied Erbil. It was Barzani, the president of Kurdistan, publicly said, when we were attacked by ISIS, Iranians were the first country supporting us, and without Iranian support, Erbil, the capital of Kurdistan of Iraq, would have collapsed in the hand of ISIS. These are the realities in the region.
All right, let me just a few reactions. One on the hashtag F24 debate. The U.S. withdrew from UNESCO for anti-Israel bias. Countdown begins for Trump to decertify Iran deal for anti-Israel deal, as an anti-Israel deal. Elon Goldenberg, is Benjamin Netanyahu writing Donald Trump's foreign policy?
I don't think Netanyahu's writing Trump's foreign policy. I mean, I do think, well, first of all, I don't think there's even unity inside Israel and unanimity inside Israel on whether you should decertify or not. I think Netanyahu seems to be pushing it. But, you know, coming from the security establishment in Israel, from the military, from the intelligence side, there's almost unanimity against decertification, just like there is here in this country, even though there's a lot of distaste in Israel for the initial deal, just the way there was here. At this point, there's a view that walking away actually puts us in a weaker position. So that view isn't necessarily shared by Netanyahu, but it's shared by many of his advisors. I also want to go back to this point on Iran in the region. I think, look, the reality is we do share some common interests. We have a common enemy in ISIS. That is true. But I also think we have some fundamental disagreements with Iran in the region. And I think that the approach that the United States should take is the same one that, quite frankly, that Iran is taking, which is we should be aggressively countering Iran in places where we disagree with Iran's behavior. But there are places where we have some common interests. It's okay to also sit and negotiate and talk about those. I mean, you know, Afghanistan, yes, Iran has in recent years provided some aid to the Taliban, but they also played a central role in propping up the first government that came into power in Afghanistan. And we, the United States, negotiated with Iran on that. In Iraq, we do have fundamental disagreements on who we would like to control parts of the country, but we've also seemed to stay out of each other's hair a lot in the last couple years as we've fought almost in parallel in Iraq against ISIS. In Syria, I think the disagreements are more fundamental and core. But the point being, and I think this is just normal behavior with a country that you are, you know, a competitor or adversary with, like Russia, China, others, you know, where you disagree, fine, you go at each other and there's disagreement, then we should be aggressively countering and putting ourselves in a better position and using coercion and those tools to put ourselves in a better position. And you can do that and at the same time leave channels open for dialogue and for talking to see if maybe there's over time opportunities for also, you know, reducing tensions or coming to some kind of political arrangement. Because look, the fighting in Syria and
Ilan Goldenberg, unfortunately, we're out of time, but I want to thank you so much for joining us from Washington. I want to thank Michael Pregin as well for being with us from the U.S. Capitol, as well as Sayed Hossein Mousavian in Princeton, New Jersey. Stay with us. Media Watch is next. And we say hello to Diptyque Laurent, the White House Chief of Staff, officially announcing that Donald Trump's big decision on Iran will come Friday.
That's right, and there's been a lot of reactions in the press. Let's start with this cartoon from The National, which is a Middle Eastern-based newspaper. In this cartoon, you see here that basically Donald Trump is taking to a house of cards that represents the Iran deal with a pair of bellows that breathe up, that pump air, essentially underlining just how futile, in a way, this whole decision is, because the deal itself is so shaky, and many people think that his decision, at least this cartoonist thinks that his decision could be quite futile. There's quite an interesting explainers, because this is a complex issue, and for many people who are not familiar with it, we don't know the ins and outs, and Vox always have great explainers. This one's really good, but it really does break down, first of all, what decertifying is, what it entails, basically that Trump must certify that Iran is in compliance with that international nuclear deal every 90 days, which he's done twice since coming to the White House. This is the third time, and this one is looking like he might not do it. And not doing it would essentially set off a process that would allow Congress to impose sanctions on Iran again. And let me just show you a tweet that's a little bit tongue-in-cheek, the whole idea of decertify. When does FIFA decertify the U.S. football team? Of course, a reference.
They failed to qualify.
That's right. Can we if Trump can decertify the deal, where are the limits? What else can be decertified? That's a question. And finally, the Financial Times has an interesting article about the 3 scenarios if he does decertify. In a nutshell, the 3 scenarios are that the deal may survive anyway, and that Congress may decide to extend or modify that timeline, that time frame. The second option is renegotiating the whole deal, and thirdly, a return to sanctions, which clearly is the least desired option for at least for everybody but the U.S. right now.
And you heard our panel reacting there to the U.S. decision to pull out of UNESCO, and the timing is interesting.
That's right. The timing is very interesting because, of course, there's a very important vote happening there to decide the next Director General of UNESCO, and the vote is between a woman of Moroccan Jewish descent and a Qatari and an Egyptian. So it's really sort of underpinning the tensions in the Middle East right now. And Donald Trump and Israel. There's actually a really interesting article from a French website called Challenge, which talks about this and says, well, is this a decision from the U.S. and Israel to pull out of UNESCO? Is that timed to the new election? Could they be trying to put pressure on other member states to vote for the candidate they back? Well, that's all speculation right now. But it does sort of tie into this cartoon here. What a tremendous Trump overview. To be continued. You see here Trump taking to a balloon representing Obama's legacy with a pin.
All right, Diptyque Laurent, many thanks. I want to thank our panel once again. Thank you for joining us here in the France 24 Debate.